Industry just got real in City Skylines 2. Today we are going big. Really big. There's a real shortage of extractor industries in the city, particularly around heavy industry. There's no stone, ore, or oil being produced in the city at all, and that means that we have to expensively import goods, and that's not good news for the profitability of our smaller industries that rely on these raw materials. So today we'll be putting that right with the creation of a massive open cast mine, and for me this is one of the most realistic looking projects I have ever done. I'll be building the infrastructure to support the new industry, and I'll talk you through some new assets and how to use them to decorate the area effectively. There's several techniques on how to get a good result. I'll show you what I've learned, what worked well and what didn't. And just as important of course are the detailing choices. I want to add contrast and I want to add vibrancy, and I'll show you how I go about decorating what will essentially be a backdrop to the main city. The inspiration for today's build is going to come from the Winterswijk quarry, a limestone quarry near the town of Winterswijk, close to the German border in the Netherlands. I'm very much going to do my own thing in terms of designing the mining area, but what I will be leaning on is the area immediately surrounding it. I want to add a bit of forestry, a bit of agriculture, and that should give us an addition of texture and colour. So to kick things off, we are going to head back to the outskirts of the city, out by the F1 track, and we are going to build a brand new interchange right here. I want to make sure that we've got enough distance from the existing interchange design, and I reckon here is exactly the correct spot. Now I'm not expecting a particularly heavy amount of traffic here. I think in terms of the development that we're going to have beside the F1 track, that might come next week by the way guys, I think we have traffic pretty well served, and a second interchange is not going to do any harm, but we really don't need anything too special. In terms of the design for this one, I'm going to lift it directly from Google Maps. I've spotted this one reasonably close to the town where we find the quarry, and I thought that would make a nice addition. Always good to pick a local option if we can. So on this side I just wanted to make sure everything feeds into the one intersection, so we just use a little roundabout trick that we usually do, and on the other side it's really just a basic diamond. Really straightforward, a few minutes to build it. I'll just make sure it's nice and tidy. Now I was ready to wrap it up and move on from there, but under close inspection we can see that we have a little bit of issue with the bridge. So time to grab move it and we will just straighten things out. Easy stuff, we just select the nodes, select the segments, snap to the object height. Yeah, and just make sure you pick all the nodes. There we go. That looks a little better, right? Now for this stretch of road, I'm not really going to do any detailing on the actual interchange itself. That's not really what this video is about, of course, but what I will do is just make sure things are going to run nice and smoothly. We'll give some slip lanes, we'll make sure that the lane maths is all sorted out there, and I think this is going to support us pretty nicely for what's to come. So job number one here in our quarry is really just to define what will be the floor of the quarry itself. Now in hindsight, this looks like a pretty big area, right? But in fact, I think I would have preferred the actual ground floor to be quite a bit bigger than what I actually landed on here. I'm also at this point going to lay out some assets from the new Cliffs and Rocks pack by Joe Geske. These assets are absolutely crucial to the whole build, and to be honest, I probably wouldn't be building this today without having access to these things on PDX mods. You're going to see me sync the very first asset. This is the tall one, the biggest one as part of the pack, and I wanted to use this really as a marker and get a benchmark for just exactly how deep into the ground I want to go. So with the road that we have, I'm simply just selecting all the nodes and the segments, syncing them down with Move It, and as you can see, didn't quite get far enough, but zooming in here, hopefully we can hit the bottom of this asset. There we go. And I'm just going to continue to terraform and bring the ground level right the way down, and this is really going to act as a base. As part of this pack, there are a number of shapes, sizes, and a few of them have got slopes on them as well. So here you can see we've got a slope. According to Joe's tutorial video on his YouTube, these slopes are at 5%, so you can get them sloping both ways. Now, don't pay attention too much to what I'm doing here. Really, this is the very first time that I've been using them. At this point, it's really just a case of really getting familiar with it and trying to form some ideas how I'm actually going to build this thing out of the ground. So a couple of things to note here as we zoom in. You can see the line there, that is effectively a transparent shader that is reflecting what is on the ground below. So if there's any terraforming, any sort of cliff textures shown, they will show through the actual asset itself. That is going to be immensely useful as we build out this design a little bit later on in the video, and it's going to be super easy to just orientate these blocks and these cliffs exactly where we want them. As you can see, they don't conform to roads, so roads we're going to have to mess about with Move It, and I'm going to show you a couple of different ways how I managed to do the roads, but I'll show you in a lot more detail as we get into the video. But first I just wanted to kind of show you the assets and give you a kind of rough idea how they work. Now, rather disappointingly, I don't seem to have recorded the next part, so I'll just do a quick spin around and show you guys what I've done. So as you can see, I've really just built up the layers and I've extended this outwards. I've kept a much steeper slope towards the city side, and towards the edge of the map I'm doing much bigger terraces, and hopefully that should give us a nice effect. Now, although I didn't record a whole big chunk of it, I'll show you guys the terraforming techniques. Pretty straightforward really. We're just going to use the slope tool and the level tool, and we're just going to build up the terraces just like I've described. You will see that the individual cliff assets that I've really just strung along every edge, they are completely aligned with the terraforming that we can see. And that terraforming, remember, shows directly through the top of the asset, and that's what I was talking about earlier on. It's really easy to align these things. So let's have a look at that in practice. So here, all I'm going to do is move it, simply just go along the edge that you can see that is showing directly through that asset, and you just go directly along the edge. Super simple. Grab and move it. You can either grab them all individually, or you can just sink one down. Make sure you're happy with the height, then go ahead and select the rest of the row. We're going to be using Move It here, and we're going to be basically just popping that down to object height. So we're just selecting the first object that we move, and we've got a pretty good effect here running directly along the cliff edge. So again, we'll have another look. This is the next row down. Gonna make sure we're happy with that. Don't know if I'm necessarily happy with the actual positioning here. We can't really see the cliff edge, so let's give it a little nudge. There we go. We just want to make sure that that is showing. We're going to do just exactly the same as we did in the row above, so let's get these things selected. Onto object height. There we go. Lovely. As you can see, it's really as simple as that. As long as there isn't a slope and it's completely flat, that is all you need to do, and it's just a case of rinse and repeat. So now we can take a look at a sloped section. So again, remember, these things have sloped assets to choose from, and again, I'm just going to use the lines that are showing directly through the asset to make sure that we've got it nicely aligned up along the slope. Now for these assets, I'm just going to select all of them. It makes sense. Remember, they're going to be different heights individually, so it does make sense to move them all together, and that almost worked pretty much first time. Again, remember, these are 5%, so unless you've been super careful on your slopes, you might have to go and adjust them individually. But I think that's actually worked pretty well with a 5% slope on this one, and I'm going to move on from here. Perfect. Now that raises the question, what are you going to do if it's not a perfect 5% slope? Well, what I would suggest doing is grabbing and using the transform tool. So we're just going to select the asset, and then it's a case of just fine tuning for that particular piece of terrain that you're working with. You will have to really just select them individually, and again, it takes a little bit of shifting about. It's a little bit footery. It's not too complicated, but once you've done it once or twice, you tend to get a little bit quicker using that. After spending quite a lot of time doing this, I can safely say that it is significantly easier doing it on a flat section. Remember, here I'm just going to be shifting them all together at the same time. But again, personal preference. I think for a flat section, it doesn't really matter what you're going to do, whether you just select them all and move them together, or whether you use the select to object tool. One thing you might have to just consider though, however, is that the terrain below the cliff face does matter as well. You will find that it will not quite necessarily just position exactly where you want it. So in those kind of cases, you will need to grab Move It, and you'll just need to shift things manually. On this tricky little section that we put in right at the very beginning, what I decided to do was really just redo the whole thing, quite frankly. I ended up just using the road here as a bit of a marker for the slope, and then I used that to guide what the actual slopes should be individually for the individual cliff pieces, and I think that worked pretty nicely actually. Guys, remember, if you like the look of the build and you want to grab the game save, Game Save is available for all Patreon members. We do also have YouTube subscriptions as well if you just want to support the channel or you want early access on the videos. Either way, big massive thank you to all the members, past and present. It does go a huge way in terms of supporting the channel and making sure that I keep doing what I'm doing. So as you can see here, it's far from the finished article, but at least we can get an idea of the depth of the development and really what's going to be involved in things to come. Now I will warn you, things are going to get an awful lot messier before they start looking good, but bear with us and we'll keep building it up. But as you can see, I started putting the roads in there now as well. Now usually I don't get too involved so much on the simulation side of things, however I am curious to see just exactly what impact this new development is going to have on our city economy. So we can see here that we've got a small surplus on agriculture and we've got a pretty big surplus on cotton. We created those extractor industries when we were doing the previous agriculture builds. So in terms of stone, of course, we are not producing any at all. And in fact, we've got a pretty big deficit, 182 tons. I think that's per month, isn't it? So I do plan on making the extractor industry area today quite large. And yeah, I just want to see just exactly how much we're going to be producing. So with that in mind, let's actually get some of these extractors planted in the ground and get them producing. Now, I'm going to use a fairly large radius on these things, but obviously I'm not going to go outside the actual build area itself. I think having one down on the actual ground floor if you like, makes sense. I did want a second one down here as well, and what I really want to see is I want to see traffic coming all the way down. In addition to that, of course, we have the flattest space, and obviously it kind of makes sense to do that. Now I am going to be using the mod Extractors Be Gone. We got an update on that, it broke on the last patch, but I am delighted to say that it has been updated and there are more options on here as well. Now I'm not going to jump into these settings too much, but just to give you an idea, you're going to have controls for per industry spawn rates, you're going to have per industry vehicle toggles, there's a button to quickly remove extractor buildings, existing ones, and a couple of bug fixes on there as well. It's a really cool mod, and for me it's fast becoming an absolutely essential one. And I think for anybody who's striving to get something that at least resembles industry or agriculture in the real life, you are going to want this mod. And obviously it just clears the decks, so to speak, and then you can detail it any way you want. But a big huge thank you to Crud89 for updating that mod, I do appreciate it. So I'm only going to use 3 or 4 extractor buildings here, and obviously they need connected. What I decided to do with the roads is just to try where I can, just try and avoid the cliff areas. It means that I don't have to terraform stuff too much, and it's only going to be a few minor adjustments on the roads, but I will show you how I'm going to do that just in case you're a wee bit confused how to go about it. So as you can see, it looks like a complete mess at the moment, but that is super important to get that stuff in place. We've got vehicles coming in and out, it is fully functional. Check out the storage numbers on there, you can see that it is extracting, and if we jump in, we can see that we now have a huge surplus, 928 tons in fact, which is a huge increase compared to what we had previously, which was precisely 0. And how I plan to use that surplus is to add a few signature buildings towards the end of the build that will directly use that stone. That stone will be processed into other goods, and hopefully that can feed into the economy. That's the plan anyway. In this view, you can see the grey surface that's down there already, and that is essentially all of the extractor area that we've kind of laid out already using those buildings. What I am now going to do is for decorative purposes, is to add an additional surface covering the entire build area. This really is just to show up where the surface is going to show and where the surface is not going to show. So as you can see, we've got a lot of the kind of green areas up just behind the individual cliffs, and that's really where the cliff asset is sticking out over and above the actual proper ground, so to speak. That's going to make things a lot easier for me when I get to the detailing and making sure every part of it is covered with the effect that I want. And talking about effects, the next thing I'm going to do is to jump into the first of the decals. I'm going to extensively use Real Vision's decal pack. There's nothing really like it on PDX mods. They're still some of the best choice, if you like, in terms of picking decals, especially when you're trying to cover a large area. Specifically on the ground floor, I am going to mix and match it a little bit more than what you'll see potentially on some of the higher levels. And here I think that is really just the active mine area, and I want it to have that sort of effect that it's actively kind of getting mushed up and messed up, and it might perhaps maybe contain a bit of groundwater or whatever else is going on. So that's definitely going to be the more varied surface, if you like, throughout this build, and the rest of them are going to be perhaps a little bit more uniform and then more heavily rely on assets rather than just the decals themselves. Now, one important thing to note is that you will see that the big diggers are there in the quarry working already. I placed them directly with Move It. Remember, the Extractors Be Gone mod basically removes all of the extractors based on the settings that I have on the mod, and I would much prefer just to place these things down individually. And I think you can see that they are placed perhaps a little bit dangerously. The top one is going directly over a road, but that should make things interesting when people are coming in and out of the quarry. The other thing I wanted to point out is the use of Move It here. You can see that I'm just going to be raising up the road ever so slightly. That's going to pull not just the road but also a bit of the ground above the shader on the cliff asset, the green part, and it's super important to try and kind of cover as much as that as possible in this particular build. So here's just another example. I'm just going to select it, Move It, bump it up a little bit, and then we can see the road going all the way through. So if we do add perhaps a little bit of industry at the end of these roads, then our traffic is not having to go through, random objects. I've used Elgendo's Dirt Road pack, absolute classic pack this one, to basically cover up some of the roads. These dirt roads of vanilla, they don't much look like dirt roads, to be honest, so these net lanes are absolutely perfect for it. The alternative to moving the road with Move It is to potentially move the individual cliffs, and all you would need to do is just select them and then just move them down like I'm showing you here. So there are a couple of ways of doing things, depending on personal preference and perhaps the individual part of the build that you're working on yourself. But one thing you'll probably notice throughout is that some of it can be quite finicky, and it's just kind of time consuming. It's not necessarily too difficult, so to speak, but yeah, everything just takes a little bit of time, and although I'm cutting out an awful lot of this stuff, then you can kind of get an idea for sort of what's involved, and once you have the big bits in place and you're happy with overall orientation, that's really when you can jump in and start the detailing. But I would perhaps recommend that you do get the overall shape first in place and then kind of get stuck into it. Again, this is looking like a complete dog's dinner. It's not looking good yet, but hopefully you guys can kind of get a feel for how things are going to look come the end. In this chapter, I'm going to show you how I dealt with the actual individual cliff edges. Now you might be thinking, well, we have cliff assets. That's what I showed you at the beginning of the video. Absolutely correct, but for our purposes, we are going to build, expand on that, and really just layer things up. There will be points here where I maybe don't necessarily want just a sheer cliff edge, and rather than that, I'd prefer having some of the stones sticking out. Now, I do, more than anything else, want to add a bit of variation on this, and that variation will give us a much more realistic look coming the end of the video. The cliff pack doesn't come with just cliffs, it also comes with a little selection of stones and slabs. Now there's only a few of them, so we do need to get a little bit creative in terms of just exactly how we're going to orientate them and position them. But remember, once we're done with this section, we're not finished the entire build yet. There's a few other things that we're going to be throwing at it to try and really just mix things up a little bit, and again, just break any sort of visual repetition, so to speak, if you like, and we're going to work really hard on making sure that that visual repetition is not present. Now that's not to say that we can't remove all of it. It'd be pretty difficult given that there's not that many assets to play with, but we can get super creative at this point, and the more we throw at it, the better result you're going to get. Sometimes more is less, and it's not going to be the mantra of this particular build, as you could probably guess. So you'll maybe notice here that I'm going to use the slab ones, constantly rotating them, but I'm also reducing the actual height of them as well. Rather than them sticking out of the ground looking like big steps, I want them to look like they've been shorn out of the cliff itself. So what I'll be doing with these slab assets is reduce the actual height of them by about 6 or 7 meters. This will very much depend on just exactly where I'm placing it. The other thing that you probably want to do is just play about with some of the snapping options as well. Depending on the location and where you're working, i.e. whether you're working on flat ground or whether you're working on the cliff edge, you might or might not want all of the snapping options on. So do have a little play about with them. I just used the 2 snapping options at the right hand side. I can't remember what they're called, but the 2 to the right, they're the only ones that really I'm toggling on and off. You'll figure it out, and yeah, it will take a little bit of experimentation, but it shouldn't take too long. As well as using those slabs, I'm also going hard with this one texture from the Real Vision pack. What I'm going to be doing for the most part on those ones is just essentially just draw a line of them, flip it 180 degrees, and draw another line of them, flip it 180 degrees, and so on and so on. One side of that particular texture or that particular decal is a little darker than the other, so what I wanted to do is kind of match the dark areas together and match the light areas together, and I think it worked pretty well, and it gave us a really good base for, for detailing. The other thing I decided to do was to go round and just bring down a lot of these cliffs just individually ever so much, and really just hide as much as that grass texture or grass shader as possible, and expose the actual surface below. Remember, if we can expose the surface below, we can actually stick decals on it, which we can't do on the shader that's part of the cliff asset. Now, that grass shader isn't a bad thing. It is amazing when you are building cliffs, but for our purposes, it's not really going to help us, get the colours into this build that I really need. And for those reasons, I am going to remove it from site as and when I can. So as I get the final few bits and pieces just covered up here, what I'm going to do now is just kind of take a step back, have a look where we are, have a quick chat about what we've done so far and what needs to be done. So you can see really we're about 3/4 of the way through getting the actual base surfaces done. Remember, that main surface that we put down, the grey one, was really just to expose what I need to build on, and really just so I can differentiate between the actual cliff grass that we can't do anything on and the actual main surface that's part of the map. And just like that, I've jumped on very quickly and basically just went and finished off the rest of it. So that again is looking a little bit of a mess still, not gonna lie, I'll be honest with you, but I think you can probably get an idea how I'm gonna tackle the green bits, and I want to essentially just hide all the green bits on here and make sure that it looks like a quarry. However, before we get on to that, I do want to add a little bit more flavour, and let's jump right into that and get cracking on with it. Around the edges, I'm going to use some of the larger assets. Again, this is all part of that cliff pack that we spoke about at the beginning. I'm going to use some of the really big ones, sink them down, and rather than having a really uniform look around the actual cliff edges, I'm going to use these things to try and jut out a little bit from the actual edge themselves, and hopefully it should break things up sufficiently and visually, again, just kind of stop that repetition around the cliff edge. I think this was a little bit time consuming. Again, you have to place them individually, you have to grab the transform tool or move it if you prefer, you can use both if you like, and really just make sure that you've got enough variation in there. The other thing I would definitely recommend is that once you do have that in place, make sure that you grab the tool brush, the Anarchy tool brush, and just lock in the positioning. You don't want these shifting about later on, because if you have to change one of them, you'll probably have to change, a couple of hundred of them. So try and avoid that if you can. So I think on that last view there, things were actually looking pretty good. It was shaping up pretty nicely, but I wasn't really quite happy. I think it was still looking a little bit plain, so I decided to carry on adding, a few extra props. You can see the boulders, we have 5 to choose from. We've got the large one, we've got the little tower one, we've got the sort of chunky boulder, we've got the slab, and then we've got the kind of double size slab one as well. I'm not quite sure exactly what it's called, but just wanted to give you an idea. Really, this is only 5 assets that we're using, to decorate the quarry, and I think there's about 4 or 5 actual cliff assets as well. So not a huge amount to choose from, but to be honest with you, it's going to give you plenty of variety if you're careful. Now, for you guys that are wondering how we are going to cover up the rest of the grass, really, we're just going to be using those sunken slabs that we were using earlier on. So far, I've pretty much just used them on flat areas, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use them on the base of the cliffs. Again, pretty straightforward. I'm going to use it at the top of the cliff, and I'm also going to use them where we have the space at the bottom of the cliffs as well. Again, it just gives us an extra little layer to build on, but crucially on that grass section, it means I can cover up the majority of it. Now, I don't mind a little bit poking out here and there, and in fact we are going to be adding a bit of greenery and a bit of vegetation later on, but as you can see, at least on that one section, it makes a huge difference, doesn't it, getting rid of that grass. Now, sometimes it will go on pretty nicely, as you can see here, sometimes just a case of spinning round and it'll go on and it'll play kind of nice, but occasionally what you need to do is just basically change the elevation on it. You might have to go up a couple of meters, or you might have to go down a couple of meters. It just depends exactly what the terrain is doing underneath the cliff asset that we put in at the start. So again, some places can be a little bit fiddly, especially where we have the slope. You need to jump into that transform tool again, and much like what we did with actual cliff edges, what we want to do is to get the you know, the cliff, I don't know, the cliff caps. Is that what you'd call them? Putting the slabs on top? I don't know. I'll let you guys name it. But you can see, you know, it's a fair bit of work, this bit, and it was quite time intensive. And yeah, it did take a while. So what I want to do for the rest of this particular section is just to show you guys just exactly how I put a lot of it together, and I want to show you guys a bit of variation. You'll see me using all of the different rock assets in different parts of the build, and I'm going to complement that with perhaps some of the you know, some of the boulder assets that we have as well. I'll pop the boulder asset up on the screen because that is a relatively new one as well. It's a real time saver, being perfectly honest with you. You know, previously I'd maybe be using the brush tool and putting down rocks individually. Now we can put them down. I mean, we can still use the ones that we've had from the beginning, but there is a specific mod that we have as well, that we have some of the lighter sort of concrete rubble as well. So yeah, really useful. But what I'll do at this point, I'll let you enjoy the little bit of a time lapse here as we put the rest of it together, and I'll catch up with you in a minute and we'll talk about a couple of detail and choices. Final little bit of work that I want to do in this chapter is just to add a little bit of blanket vegetation. Now I'm going to be using Padelma's long grass props. Absolutely beautiful. What I thought I'd do is put a light coating of them just all over. Remember, when I plant these down, they're going to go ground level. So on a lot of these cliff faces, they are strutting out above the actual ground itself, so they'll disappear and they should ideally just appear on the actual ground itself and not the asset. And that worked, but it was a little bit too thick of vegetation, so I ended up taking quite a bit of it out. I removed all the bits around the road. That was always supposed to be the case, but here down on the ground level it was just too much, so I just weaked them back out. You will see a couple of them here and there, but really not really all that too much. One thing I absolutely will be doing though is re-adding some really sort of dense bush vegetation here and there, and what I'm going to be doing is running back to our good old reliable oak tree asset. I'm going to use the smaller ones and I am basically going to sink them into the ground. And here what I'm going to do is I'm really just going to go through the entire cliff face of the entire build and really look for little crevices and just add additional contrast by adding this dark plant. I think it worked really well. I'm also going to be using them at the end as a bit of a border to the actual development itself, and in addition to that I'm going to kind of continue that theme, and we're going to be building out some fields, basically some really simple detailing, you know, at the end in the countryside. I'm not going to get really into the weeds, if you pardon the pun, with what's going to appear outside of this development. Really, this is right at the very edge of the map, and it doesn't make any sense, you know, having really sort of dense development of any sort of description out here. What I might do later on potentially is add some farmland, but again, I think we've got we've got an entire map to play with, right? There's tons of space to fill. But back to the task in hand, and here, as I said, what I'm going to do is just add a little bit of concentrated vegetation now and again. Perhaps maybe this was part of the quarry that maybe was used a little bit less, so we've had more time to really just get that vegetation overgrowing and kind of sticking out. And here's the border I talked about earlier on. Again, I'm going to be actually using the individual tree placement tool on this one. I think having that border up the top, that looks brilliant, to be honest with you. That's one of the little things I think it was really missing, and I'm really going to kind of hammer home and give it a real thick vegetation. This will act obviously as a visual border and a nice visual effect, but also from a realistic sort of health and safety point of view, it'll also help keep people out of the development. Now, I think you would probably imagine perhaps a fence or two, but I don't think I really need it here, to be honest with you. I think we can use our imagination. But having a look here, that looks like a vast amount of area, doesn't it? But it does look good, I must admit. And it's not too far off the kind of limestone quarry that we have very loosely based some of the inspiration on. So a couple of quick details here just to finish off. Now that may be the main face of the quarry really done. I think I'm really happy with the detail in that. I think it looks sensational, doesn't it? I think it's without doubt the closest to a real life project that I have built in City Skylines 2. Those cliff assets and then complementing it really nicely with the Real Vision decals has really worked a treat. But as I say, we're not finished yet, and what I wanted to do, and I spoke about this much earlier in the video, was to add a few of the signature buildings. These two, I can't remember what they're called. They are from the supply chain pack, however, and they are going to be using the stone that we are quarrying here. So really nice. I think having them sort of butted up together kind of makes it look like a bit of a larger facility. And then I'm going to use some of the ore storage. I don't think they'll use the ore storage as far as I know, unless they're bringing ore in and are importing it and then storing it here. But I don't think they will actually use the stone to store it. I think that is ore specific, but the assets did look the part and I'm pretty happy with them. Taking a bit of time, I reckon, to hide the grass is definitely worth it. I think when we have a look at the real life one there at the beginning, you do see that industrial dug up looking sort of dirt, and it's always the colour of whatever's been mined as well. And that's the same if you look at anything really, to be honest with you. There was actually a lime quarry in South Florida I was going to do as part of the Cape Loman series, and I didn't quite get round to it. And I don't think we actually had the assets, and we certainly didn't have the decals at the time either. But yeah, I think it's a nice little addition, and it's nice to see that we've got some extractors and then we've got some processing facilities right next to each other as part of the one facility. The surrounding area, I am just really going to build out some really basic farms. We saw those sort of irregular shapes at the very beginning on the real life facility. I'd like to kind of mirror that here, and again, it's pretty quick. Doesn't take me very long to do that, just drawing them out with the trees, and again we're sticking with the oaks, but I am going to add a little bit of denser forestry here. Now I do use Tree Controller to disable all tree growth in the map. Now the downside of that is that with that particular setting, the forestry functionality doesn't work, so in case anyone's thinking, you know, add some forestry here, there's a good reason why I won't be doing that later on. If you guys are starting a new map, I absolutely recommend using the vanilla tool that you can essentially just stop tree growth on the ones that you're plopping down. You can't use them for forestry, but you just toggle it off and then you can start using it for your forestry builds. For me, it's too late though. I'm committed. I don't want any of my trees growing. What will happen is if that switches on, and I think I spoke about it a couple of weeks, the rest of the city just gets completely overgrown. So for me in this build, you're never going to see a functional forestry build, and that's the reason why. Of course, in any quarry, you'd expect a good number of vehicles, so I am going to plop them around and give them a little bit of a recolouring. The other thing I'm going to do is just break up some of the visual colouring on the actual quarry itself. Now, I am going to recolour some of these things, really just to add a little bit of spice and a little bit of colour. I think it was a little bit too dark though, however, so I just adjusted it on the recolour, went round there, toned it down a little bit. And again, I just wanted a little bit of a different shade on it. I didn't want the entire thing completely different. Now, the funny thing about this video is that I was looking for something quick, simple, and not that complex to build. I was in Stockholm last week for the creator meetup with Paradox and an Iceflake, and that was awesome. I'm hoping I'll speak a little bit more about that in the channel when I have the time. And then this week, I've got a little bit of a break in Amsterdam for a couple of days with friends, and that means that it's been a real squeeze to try and get any content out for a few weeks. However, that said, it's amazing what you can do when you put yourself under a little bit of pressure. So this build was of course not simple, it was not a quick one to make either, and if I'm being completely honest, it just turned out completely insane. I'm actually kind of taken aback how really well this actually turned out. I think 100% this is probably one of the absolute most realistic looking builds that I have ever pulled together, and in no small part in that are the modders and the asset creators who put in countless hours to give us all of these goodies, all of these tools, all of these assets, and it's really massively appreciated. In the previous video, I asked you guys for ideas in terms of, big developments that we can have on the outskirts of the map. I can see that you guys have given me loads of ideas. I've not managed to respond to any of them yet. As I say, I'm just super busy at the moment, but please do keep them coming while you're at it. And if you're in that comment section, let me know what you thought about this build as well. That's it for me, guys. I'll see you in the next one.